Probably heard this story before, but I really think it bears repeating, because it really, for me, sets the foundation for myself. Whenever I think about what's important to me in chiropractic, what do I want to learn about, what do I want to integrate into my own practice and life. And it's the story of a guru who had his students around him, and he wanted to teach them a particularly important lesson on this particular day. So in front of him he had some large boulders, he had some basins full of sand, and he had some jugs full of water. And he wanted to teach them this life principle that applied to everything in everybody's life. So the first thing he did was he had a very large basin, and he started to pick up the boulders and put them into this large basin, and one by one filling up the basin. And he told his students, you tell me when you think that the basin is full. So eventually, obviously, you could see the boulders come over the top of the rim of the basin, and the first boulder rolled off and fell out of the basin. And so the student said, Master, the basin is full, you can't put any more rocks in there. And he said, so you think it's full? Do you think I could fit anything else in there? And they said, no, that's it, it's as full as can be. So then he took some sand and he started to pour the sand, and of course the sand grains started to flow and to pour in between the crevices and in between the boulders, and started to fill the spaces in between the rocks. And eventually it got to the point where the sand started to pour over the edges of the basin, and the student said, Master, the basin's full, you can't put any more in there. And he said, are you sure that the basin's as full as it can be? And they said, well, yes, what else could you possibly put in there? So then he took his jugs of water and started to pour it onto the sand over the rocks, and as you can imagine, the water started to seep and trickle between the grains of sand and between the crevices in the rocks, and slowly filled up the basin till the water started to pour out the edges of the basin. And once again the student said, Master, the basin's full, you cannot put anything more into that bowl. So he paused and he said, well, what is the lesson here? And one of the students put his hands up quickly and said, I know what the answer is, I know what the answer is. And he said, what is the answer? And he said, well, you kept putting more and more into the basin, and we kept thinking it was full, but you kept finding other ways of putting more and more into the basin. And so, Master, life is like that. No matter how full you think your life is, you can always fit more in. And he said, no, you've missed the whole point of the whole story. He said, imagine if I hadn't put the big rocks in first. Imagine if I filled up the basin with the water. Then if I'd had water, I wouldn't have been able to put the sand in, because it would have tipped the water out. And once the sand was in, the boulders would have just sat on top. So the principle of the story is always put the biggest boulders in first. It is being a lesson in what is the most important things that we do. What are the most fundamental, what are the biggest ideas that we put into our practice on a day-to-day basis. Get those in first, and then you can add in extras around that if you so wish. So during this year we're going to explore some of the oldest writings of chiropractic. We're going back to 1927, we're going back to 1914, and we're going to look at the chiropractic textbook by RW Stephenson, and we're going to look at The Chiropractor by D.D. Palmer. And at the same time we're going to look at similes between what was happening in physics and some of the other sciences through these same periods, and as time has gone on, how they've slowly aligned with what was written about back in the early 1900s. So let's begin with Stephenson's 33 Principles. I know many of you have probably read these over the years. Hopefully you've read them over the years. Hopefully you go back from time to time and study them. Every time I go back and read them, I discover something new and explore a new area as a result of what I'm finding there. So Stephen's 33 Principles, I imagine that Principle 1 is pretty important. And maybe that's the biggest rock of all the biggest rocks. And indeed it is called the major premise. So if you like, this is the biggest of the big rocks. So here it is. There is universal intelligence in all matter. Now, Some of you are already probably feeling a bit tense in your shoulders at the mere mention of the word universal intelligence, because I know we're criticised for using that terminology. There's a big move in the undercurrents of the profession to remove these kinds of terms from our whole language and to jettison these philosophies as being religious or being too spiritual or being too unscientific. But here we are in our 33 principles. Principle number 1, the major premise: there is a universal intelligence in all matter. So we're not just talking about us. We're not the only smart ones on the planet. All matter has intelligence that organises it. So it gives to matter all its properties and actions. It's fairly common sense to me. Like, how's anything going to happen unless something makes it happen? So there has to be some sort of intelligence that drives things, makes things happen. We're not talking about where did it come from. We're not talking about is it an old fellow with a white beard sitting behind the clouds checking up on us. We're talking about the fact that there is organisation. So it maintains existence. It makes things live. It makes things organised. So if we look more at the detail of this principle, so the physical properties which matter has are but force continually given to it by intelligence. So you're going to find these terms recurring in the 33 principles, recurring in what DD wrote about, and indeed recurring in quantum physics. So force is given to matter by intelligence. So without intelligence, matter is not arranged. You could think of the master putting the rocks in the bowl, putting the sand in the bowl, putting the water in the bowl. If the master wasn't there, the rocks, the sand, the water would have stayed on the side, would never have found their way into the bowl. And so things in the planetary systems, in the universe, in the biology, require something to make things happen. So without intelligence, force has no direction. So we're seeing matter, we're seeing force, energy, the things that actually generate things to happen. There needs to be force, there needs to be energy to get things moving. But this has no direction unless there is a director. So the perfect expression of intelligence can be limited by matter. Obviously there is difficulty with matter getting it to do what it needs to do or what it should be doing. And there can be a breakdown somewhere in the process of intelligence using force to make matter do what it needs to do. So life is a combination of intelligence, force and matter. Think of life as being three-dimensional. And again, we're going to see this in a recurring pattern as we go through our exploration of this topic. So chiropractors are not the only one who've talked about principles such of universal intelligence. In fact, there are some people who've even used the very same language. Now, they don't cite their sources, so I don't know whether they've stolen them from chiropractic or whether they're just somehow in a parallel universe have come up with similar terminologies. So this is James Putnam. So he talks about there is more to intelligence than human intelligence. So things didn't just start to happen in the world when we arrived. Things were already happening before man needed to do what man wanted to do. So intelligence is a property of the universe and all that is in it. Universal intelligence is the intrinsic tendency for things to self-organise and co-evolve into ever more complex, intricately interwoven and mutually compatible forms. So we just simply have to accept that things have been designed somehow, things have somehow put together, somehow things become organised, somehow things become, suddenly things have motion, suddenly things have purpose. So all of these things have to come from somewhere, have to be driven by something. So here we have DD back in 1914 in the Chiropractor, which is a rare text. Not many chiropractors have this text. You can find it often on Amazon nowadays, and it's worth a read. Like, I actually don't think DD was a particularly good author. I struggle to read his writing more so than RW Stephenson's. I find his writings quite easy to read, and BJ was quite poetic in some of his writings. DD's quite dry and quite critical in some aspects. But every now and then there's a little gem that pops out, and you've got to be willing to persist to read through to find these gems. So the universe is composed of intelligence and matter. That the latter is neither intelligent nor creative, while the former is omnipresent, filling all space. That this creative intelligence uses material substance for expression, and that life is the direct result of this intelligence, seeking advancement towards perfection by the use of visible, corporeal organisms. So let's use simple logic if we're talking about universal intelligence. If life isn't stupid, then it must be intelligent. So it's interesting when we look at some of the differences in philosophy of, say, modern medicine versus more traditional chiropractic. There almost is a sense in modern medicine that life is stupid. I've heard life as described as a sexually transmitted, terminally incurable disease. And there's this sense that, when you talk sometimes to people in the medical profession and some of the scientific communities, that the human body is just built to degenerate and degrade and age, and basically things go wrong. So it's almost like this idea that things are built to kind of deteriorate unless man steps in and fixes things. But here in chiropractic, we have this philosophy that, no, hang on a minute, the body's actually self-regulating, self-healing. It's actually able to evolve, it's actually able to heal itself, and indeed every second of its life is trying to regenerate and to heal itself and to repair itself. So it's pretty damn smart. In fact, when you really think about it, it's amazingly intelligent. So where does that intelligence come from? There's this idea that somehow it's built into the universe. So if we look at another theory, that of intelligent design, again we start to see parallel principles appearing. So life depended upon information. And it's critical that you notice that word information, because you're going to see when we start to get in quantum physics, they don't talk so much about intelligence, but they do talk a lot about information. And I think arguably we're talking about interchangeable terms. So life depended upon information whose structure was not only independent of its physical or chemical form, but whose ordering was not amenable to explanation by physical or chemical laws. I guess from some evolutionary theories there's this kind of reverse engineering principle that at some point, as things started to somehow collect together, that at some point intelligence began to increase and to develop. Whereas this principle is saying the opposite, that the intelligence had to predate the development of matter being organised and put together and put into more and more complicated and intelligent, and clever packages. Now, I guess where this gets controversial is people start to say that we're talking about religion here, we're talking about God, we're talking about spirituality, and I guess there is a fine line that we may be stepping over, because even if you go back into the scriptures, you will actually find that it refers to some of these same principles. So this is from Proverbs, which were the passages written by Solomon, who was regarded as the wisest man that had ever lived. So I guess we should listen to what he wrote about. And again, he's a great poet, really great stuff to read and to soak in. So in this passage he's talking about wisdom, And again, you might use the term wisdom interchangeably with intelligence. So the Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. So intelligence was there before everything else almost. I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water. Before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the world or its fields or any of the dust of the earth, I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary so that the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world and delighting in mankind. So it's almost talking about this same principle, that there was this built into the universe was wisdom that enables other things to happen. So let's move on. Stephenson's principle number 2. We could get stuck on each of these principles for hours on end. So the chiropractic meaning of life. Man, we've got the major premise, we've got the big rock, and now we've got the meaning of life. I love that Monty Python movie, what is the meaning of life? Donald Adams in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, the answer to the meaning of life was 42. So we can look at it from Hume's point of view, but here's the chiropractic meaning of life. It is the expression of universal intelligence through matter. That's what life is. I guess when we think about that point in time of being conceived, when we don't exist and suddenly we exist, or we think about that point in time at the other end of our life, when we're alive and then we're not, we're dead. What happens in those moments? Something appears, something disappears. But while we're living, then we're having this continuous expression of universal intelligence through our matter. So life is the expression or the manifestation of intelligence. So moving on, Stephenson's 33 principles, number 3. And here we're talking about the union of intelligence and matter. How do these two things get together? So life is the union of intelligence and matter. Matter cannot exist, let alone be organised, without intelligence. So the photo I've got there of a sailing ship with its sails full of wind. And think of the intelligence as being, the wind, that we can't see it. We don't know it's there. We can't perceive it. We can't actually see wind blowing, but we can perceive that the wind is there because we can see it filling the sails. And so with matter, we can see that matter's moving. We can see that matter's being organised. We can see that matter's creating things and being put together and being regenerated and being replaced and being recycled, and all of these things are going on continuously. So we can see signs of intelligence. And when those two things are put together, that's when we have life. So all matter is in motion. So we're going to see that when we look at quantum physics. When you get to a subatomic level, there is just constant movement, almost to the point where they wonder whether there's even any matter there anymore. But we'll look at that as we move along. So all matter is in motion. Even if you look at a brick or a rock, it looks stationary, but at a subatomic level there's movement of particles and subatomic particles. So here we go, D.D. Palmer again in 1914, talking about life. Life is intelligent action, movements guided by intelligence. What is it which is present in the living body and absent in the dead? It is an intelligent force which I saw fit to name innate, usually known as spirit. So you can see why people start to get uncomfortable, because DD was quite blunt in interchanging terms in terms of spirit. I know when you listen to some chiropractors and they talk about universal intelligence, to them, in a sense, they're talking about their God. There's quite a lot of reverence. There's almost a degree of worship of innate and universal intelligence. So it can get to that point of being spiritual, religious. Perhaps it doesn't need to, but perhaps it kind of almost does once you really start to appreciate, comprehend and accept these principles. So Stephenson's 33 principles, here we are, number 4, moving along as quickly as we can. We need to get through these. So the triune of life, the triangle of life if you like, the 3 components of life. We already said that life is 3-dimensional. So there are 3 necessary united factors: intelligence, force and matter. They're the 3 dimensions of life. They're the 3 dimensions of existence. They're the 3 dimensions that make the universe work. They're the 3 dimensions that make you as a human being work. It's interesting because we often see that the 3 factors appear. We talk in chiropractic about the triune of health. We talk about the 3 causes of subluxation. The Bible talks about being spirit, body and soul. In religious terms they talk about the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. So it's probably not coincidence that we continuously repeatedly see these 3 factors appear in different manifestations. So no intelligence, no matter. There's no way that matter can do anything unless there's some intelligence there. And the way that intelligence gets matter to do things is by using force. So without intelligence there can be no matter. Without matter, intelligence cannot be expressed. If you don't have sails on the ship, you can't see the wind moving and the ship cannot move. So we need to have this continuous interplay between the different dimensions. The bond between the 2 is force. So intelligence uses force to organise and to change what matter is doing. So let's look at quantum physics. Let's jump out of chiropractic philosophy and look at physics, like one of the most basic sciences there is. It's interesting when you look at the qualifications of some of these physicists that we're going to be looking at. A lot of them are called theoretical physicists. They did a lot of research, a lot of hard, cold measurement of physical factors, but at some point they have to put this into concepts and ideas and theories as to how these things happen. And of course the most famous and the most loved and the most revered of all the physicists is Albert Einstein. So let's look at Einstein's theorem of special relativity. And nearly everybody can quote the terms that are in there. E equals mc squared. It's interesting, when do you think that this theorem was proposed? When I first asked that question to myself, I thought, I reckon it was probably in the 30s. I reckon it was probably in the 1930s. Einstein's theorem of special relativity was published in 1905. So we've got that interesting simile, that interesting parallel that happens, because here we have chiropractic developing in 1895. And DD publishing his book in 1910 and then in 1914, and then Stephenson publishing in 1927. This similar era where we see almost parallel theorems coming out of very different fields. So what is E equals mc squared? E is energy equals m, mass, times c squared. So what's the c? The c is a constant. It's the speed of light. And it's basically the biggest number that physicists can think of. Nothing is bigger, nothing is faster than the speed of light. So if you remove the constant, because constant's a constant, what are we left with? We're left with E equals M. What an interesting concept that is. Energy equals mass. Energy equals matter. So this was the huge quantum shift. We talk about paradigm shifts a lot in chiropractic. And often when we talk about paradigm shifts, we're assuming that everybody else needs to have one, that we've had it. But in fact, we need to have paradigm shifts all the time. You need to have these aha moments. The light bulbs needs to switch on at different times in our career. So this was the breakthrough, that the divide between energy and matter, the inseparable, the unthinkable, was thought that energy equals matter. They're different manifestations of the same thing. It was actually proposed in a slightly different format. It wasn't E equals MC squared originally, it was actually M equals E divided by C squared. So it was actually explaining what is matter. We've asked the question before, what is life? So what Einstein was saying that was matter was a different form, a different manifestation, if you like, of energy. When they were looking more and more into more and more microscopic details as to atoms, and then to electrons and neutrons and protons, and then subatomic particles, and then, as they got further and further and further in, it got to the point where they asked the question, is there really any matter anywhere? Like, it seems to be that the further we get in, the more the space we find.